The snow had already begun to fall in the hills of Vermont when the Bell family arrived in the village of Quietude, a place so far from anything modern that time seemed to stall at its edge. The wheels of their black lacquered carriage left twin grooves in the fresh powder as it rolled past the chapel, the smithy, the bakery, and finally toward the parcel of land that had once been a sawmill, now restructured into what they would call Bell Hollow Academy. The villagers gathered in silence that morning, watching from behind windows and cracked doors as the newcomers stepped out with gentle poise, their clothing immaculate despite the cold. Silas Bell, tall and rigid, wore a long gray coat and moved with deliberate control, his hands always clasped, never swinging. Beside him, his wife Miriam held a parasol against the flurry, even though there was no sun. Their 3 adult children trailed behind, all dressed in muted browns and blacks, smiling quietly but never speaking first. What struck the townsfolk most was their calm. No arrogance, no rush, just a quiet precision in how they moved, like they'd rehearsed their entrance long before the snow began to fall. Within a week, flyers were posted in nearby counties advertising a progressive academy for children who did not fit easily into common schooling. Bell Hollow would be a sanctuary, they claimed, for young minds that were sensitive, brilliant, or wounded. Children's society had misunderstood. Word spread quickly. Local papers printed short pieces marveling at the family's refinement, their dignified speech, and their noble goal. Silas in particular was praised for his eloquence. He spoke with the ease of a preacher but without scripture, as if guided not by God but by the slow, certain rhythm of logic. His wife rarely spoke at all in public. She simply smiled with her eyes and listened like she could absorb a person's soul in the silence between words. The academy opened its doors with little fanfare but much curiosity. Townspeople were invited for a modest gathering, a supper, mostly porridge and root vegetables, during which the children were asked to remain out of sight. Silas explained almost apologetically that they were adjusting to a quiet curriculum, and that overexposure to strangers could disrupt their internal balance. No one questioned it. The man spoke with such measured gravity that even doubt seemed impolite. By spring, the first few children had arrived, each delivered in the middle of the night by unmarked wagons, always alone, never accompanied by kin. Some came from as far as Massachusetts and New York. They were not the sons and daughters of privilege. They were whispered about as the misfits of proper homes, the kind of children who made too much noise or stared too long or refused to speak at all. Locals began to notice things small at first. A child seen walking barefoot across snow to fetch water from the well, a strange lullaby humming from behind closed windows at dawn. A row of bird cages hanging in the attic, each one holding a dead sparrow, wings pinned open with wire. But every time these oddities were brought up, the Bells had explanations. The barefoot girl was being hardened for resilience, the lullaby was part of their therapeutic waking, and the birds were part of a natural science lesson on decay. The way they spoke, especially Silas, made people feel foolish for being unnerved. What no one saw, what no one even thought to look for, was the room below the foundation, the one sealed with tongue and groove boards behind the coal pile, where the walls were lined with faded portraits of children no one recognized, or the meticulous ledgers kept in Miriam's hand, locked inside a chest with no keyhole, listing behaviors in columns, frequency of blinking, delay in obedience, pitch of nighttime weeping. The Bells were scientists of discipline, but their laboratory was hidden beneath charm, and charm, they knew, disarmed even the most cautious heart. By the time summer came, Bell Hollow had 23 students. Some were seen less and less often, but their names remained on the roll call. Silas explained that sensitive children often required extended solitude. The villagers accepted this. After all, Who were they to challenge a man who spoke so beautifully about salvation through silence? Who were they to question a family that had brought promise to their forgotten town? Quietude had always lived up to its name, and now it would learn that silence could also be a kind of grave. The advertisements were small, written in soft old-fashioned script, tucked into the corners of regional broadsheets and circulars. They promised sanctuary for the misunderstood child, not a cure but care, not correction but a kind of reverent discipline. The words were careful, dressed in restraint, speaking to the kind of parent who had already grown tired. Parents whose children cried too much or stared into space too long. Parents who had prayed and punished, spanked and begged, and now simply wanted peace in the home again. The Bell Hollow Academy, the ads claimed, specialized in exceptional cases. Children who suffered from fits, who lied without remorse, who harmed animals, who soiled their beds well past toddlerhood, or who wandered the woods whispering to no one. To the frightened and ashamed, it sounded like salvation. Letters arrived first, some desperate and tear-stained, others matter-of-fact and bureaucratic. Silas read each one aloud at the supper table like a priest reciting confession, while Miriam quietly wrote notes in her small black journal. A girl who scratched her face in her sleep until her skin bled. A boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years. A set of twins whose parents believed they shared a contagious grief after the death of a younger sibling. These were not applications. They were declarations of surrender. Within weeks, the arrivals began. They came alone, always alone, sometimes escorted by a distant uncle or hired carriage. There were no tearful goodbyes, just a mother stepping away quickly, a father who never left the wagon. The children were pale, wide-eyed, and oddly quiet. Some clung to their only bag. Some didn't bring a single thing. One girl arrived with hair so matted it had to be cut off entirely. Another boy came barefoot, having run from his previous caretaker to escape nightly confinement in a cupboard. None of them knew what Bell Hollow really was. They were told only that it was a school, a place where they would be better, where they would stop being a problem. The staff, which was never more than the Bell children themselves and a few mute groundskeepers, never asked about family. Once a child crossed the gate, their past was gently erased. Names were changed for uniformity. Letters home were encouraged but not mailed. Photographs were not permitted, and clothing was burned and replaced with plain brown linen. The children were grouped by sleep patterns, not age. They were called not by their names but by behavioral labels: the wanderer, the scriber, the trembler. It was easier, Silas believed, to teach them who they should become by first stripping away who they thought they were. By the end of the year, 47 children had filled the dormitory halls of Bell Hollow Academy. To the outside world, it was seen as a noble institution built on mercy and reform. But inside, something older had been reawakened, something that did not seek to correct these children but to quiet them, study them, break them apart and put them back together into something else, something clean, something symmetrical, something silent. At Bell Hollow Academy, nightfall was not marked by the setting sun but by the ringing of a single silver chime, soft, deliberate, and final. From that moment forward, no child was allowed to speak. The rule was not explained. It was simply given. Any word spoken after the chime was a violation, and violations were met not with punishment but with what Silas Bell called realignment. The children did not yet know what realignment meant, but they began to learn its shape by watching who returned from it and who didn't. At first, the silence felt like a game, but as the days passed, the children grew anxious at dusk. Some cried softly before lights out. Others held their breath, afraid even their breathing might betray them. Those who forgot who whispered questions in bed or let slip a panicked whimper in the dark, were taken, always in the same way. A creak in the hall, a faint shuffle of feet, then the slow turn of a brass doorknob. The child would be called only once by number. The bed would be left neatly made the next morning. Elspeth Meyer was the first to try writing a letter. She'd only been at Bell Hollow for 6 weeks, but the silence was already breaking something inside her. At 12 years old, she'd been described by her own aunt as impossibly dramatic. But now, her energy was gone. She wrote the letter on a torn piece of arithmetic paper, hiding it inside the lining of her wool coat. In it, she begged her mother to come. She wrote about the rule of silence, about children disappearing in the night, about the boy in the west corridor who screamed without sound. She slipped the letter into the outgoing postbox before morning, folding it into a stack of lesson plans where she knew one of the Bell children would retrieve it. But it never left the building. 2 days later, she was called to the atrium, a wide, cold room where the children were not permitted unless summoned. When she returned, she wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. She had no bruises, no blood. But she no longer spoke even during daylight. Her fingers trembled constantly, and she scratched her skin in her sleep until her nails broke. She sat alone and drew spirals over and over again until her fingers were raw. She never mentioned the letter again. Whispers spread. Some children believed Elspeth had been shown what was beneath the floorboards, a place no one had seen but all feared. Others claimed the Bells had taken her voice with a needle behind the ear. Still others believed something lived inside the mirrors and that if you spoke at night, it would learn your name. The truth was never spoken aloud. Fear did not live in shouts or screams at Bell Hollow. It lived in silence, and it fed on every word that was never said. Behind a corridor that never appeared on the official blueprints, past a bookshelf that slid open without hinges, there was a wing of Bell Hollow Academy that no child was meant to know about. It was built with brick and timber like the rest of the structure, but its walls had been reinforced, its floor coated in something smooth and soundless. At the center of this forbidden space sat a single, soundproof room made entirely of thick glass, sealed tight from all sides, framed by dark oak beams polished to an unnatural shine. No light entered from the outside. The room was lit only by a single pendant bulb that burned cold and colorless, like a star pulled too close to the earth. This was not a room for punishment. It was a room for observation, designed with intention, calculation, and something else harder to name. Children sent to the glass room were chosen for reasons never explained. They were not always the ones who misbehaved. Often they were simply the ones who blinked too often, who avoided eye contact, who fidgeted during recitations. Once chosen, they were escorted without force, often gently by one of the Bell's sons, who smiled and reassured them the whole way down. But once inside, the door clicked shut with a metallic finality. No bed, no chair, no blanket. The temperature was kept slightly too cold to sleep and just warm enough not to die. Their shoes were removed, their outer garments taken. They were given a gray robe and a small metal cup of a milky, bitter liquid that dulled their hunger but never fed them. Some were left there for hours, others for days. The walls offered no privacy. Staff, and on some occasions Miriam Bell herself, would stand on the other side of the glass, clipboard in hand, watching. They wrote down how long a child cried before going still, how often they scratched their arms, whether they avoided the mirror that stood bolted to the far end of the wall. That mirror was the strangest part. No matter how close a child stood, no reflection ever came back. It was not a trick of the light. It was something else. Some said it wasn't a mirror at all, but a window. But to where, no one could say. By the third day, most children stopped crying. Some began to speak to the mirror. not to beg but to explain themselves as if the void might offer forgiveness. One boy was kept inside for 6 days. When he was removed, his hair had gone completely white, and his left eye twitched every few seconds in perfect rhythm. He never made a sound again, not even in his sleep. The Bells called the room a calibration chamber. In their private journals, they recorded what they believed to be success, silence, obedience, and in some rare cases, the elimination of the self entirely. And for them, that was the goal. Not to teach, not to guide, but to erase the chaos of childhood and leave behind something clean, something hollow. Silas Bell never referred to it as punishment. He called it refinement, the quiet process of reshaping a child's nature to align with civility and control. In the dim light of his private study, far removed from the glass observation room and the dormitories above, he kept a series of locked drawers that held polished surgical tools wrapped in clean cloth, each labeled not by name, but by outcome. He had once apprenticed under a Boston physician before his fall from grace, though no charges were ever brought. His curiosity had unsettled even seasoned surgeons, but in Bell Hollow he had no one to answer to. Here his philosophy could thrive, that disobedience was not defiance but disease, and disease could be corrected with precision. He began first with the ears. Children who flinched at commands or failed to respond quickly were diagnosed with willful dissonance, a term he coined to justify what came next. He would numb the outer ear with a solution made from poppy paste, and then insert a curved, rusted probe into the canal. The goal, he wrote, was to disrupt the equilibrium, thereby forcing the child to depend entirely on external guidance. Several children emerged unable to walk without assistance, their balance permanently ruined. But they were quiet after that, and for Silas, quiet was the first sign of progress. Next came the tongue, those who spoke out of turn, who wept too loudly, who prayed in whispers at night despite the silence rule. They were seen as infected with reflexive expression. For them, the procedure was simpler. A thin hook was inserted beneath the tongue, used to stretch and tighten the tendon until speaking became painful. Some children stopped speaking altogether. Others bit through their tongues in their sleep. The blood was always cleaned by morning, the pillows burned, and the offenders reassigned to the mirror dormitory, where speaking was never necessary. But the worst was reserved for those who fidgeted. Silas believed the hands held sin. Twitching fingers, restless palms, clenched fists were signs of untamed will. So he kept a leather-bound register of what he called impulse sins, a tally of infractions measured by how often a child moved without instruction. When the number grew too high, he would bring them to the red basin room, where a single stool waited beneath a skylight blackened with ash. There he would remove one fingernail at a time using a dull spoon hook, believing the pain would teach patience and stillness. One child, age 9, had all 10 removed before Silas declared him quiet in the hands. His fingers never closed again. None of these procedures left visible scars for long. Silas ensured the skin remained smooth, the voices soft, the eyes dry. To any outsider, Bell Hollow looked peaceful, but beneath that calm surface was a methodical horror masquerading as reform, a man who believed pain could sculpt virtue and silence was not absence but achievement. His madness was not loud, it was measured, dressed in white gloves and written in perfect cursive across the pages of a ledger that never left his side. Miriam Bell was not like her husband. Where Silas moved with control and spoke in calculated words, Miriam lived in softness, an ever-present smile, eyes that blinked too slowly, hands that folded neatly over her apron whether she was seated, walking, or standing over something that didn't belong above ground. Her world was the greenhouse, an angular glass structure tucked behind the main wing of Bell Hollow, warmed year-round by an underground coal pipe that gave off a faint smell of metal and damp rot. Inside it grew rows of perfect purple lilacs, blooming long past their natural cycle, their petals unnaturally saturated, their stems too stiff. Parents who visited in the early months were invited to walk through the greenhouse. Miriam would offer them tea and let them hold a clipping, encouraging them to inhale deeply. The lilacs, she claimed, represented resilience. She never mentioned what fed them. She spent her days among the plants, trimming with tiny shears, humming softly, sometimes sprinkling a milky liquid from unlabeled bottles onto the roots. The children were not allowed near the greenhouse unless summoned. When they did enter, it was in silence and always alone, sent to help her repot, rearrange, or scrub the glass walls. These visits often ended with headaches or nosebleeds. One child collapsed after an hour and woke unable to recognize her own name. She was moved to the mirror dormitory and never assigned again. What no one outside the family knew was that Miriam had once studied funerary arts under a relative in Massachusetts. Her interest had always been the preservation of the body, the stillness of it, the beauty of holding something between life and rot. She kept jars beneath the greenhouse table, some with insects, others with organs. Tiny preserved things that no one had catalogued. Over time, the soil began to blacken. It stained the soles of boots, clung to the children's hems. Miriam called it deep soil and insisted it helped the lilacs grow beyond their time. But beneath that soil, below the floorboards that warped in the summer heat, lay rows of sealed urns packed tightly and labeled with symbols rather than names. A groundskeeper, Wicket, once slipped while loading coal into the greenhouse stove and cracked a section of the floor. The soil beneath was loose, greasy, and pungent. He dug only a few inches before he found bone, small, white, brittle, not animal, not whole. He told no one at first. But the next week his room was emptied and a new man took his place without explanation. His name was never mentioned again. Later, when the school was investigated long after the fire, it was the greenhouse that horrified authorities most. Beneath the foundation were 14 urns, 6 containing canine and feline remains, but the rest unmistakably human. Tiny ribs, finger bones, and one malformed skull. They were packed in formaldehyde-soaked linens, preserved as if waiting to be studied or remembered. Yet no record of burials, deaths, or medical waste was ever found in the school's books. Miriam had logged only her fertilizer formulas, mixtures involving animal fat, pine ash, and a thick syrup she rendered herself from the basement stove. To Miriam, the greenhouse was not a garden. It was a chapel, a place where silence could be honored and decay delayed. She believed the lilacs were proof that beauty could bloom from anything, even ruin, especially ruin. Her evil was not loud, not even intentional in the way Silas's was. It was delicate, quiet, cultivated. And like her lilacs, it was made to outlast the season it belonged to. Elspeth Meyer was 12 years old when she realized no one outside Bell Hollow would ever believe her. The adults smiled too calmly, the windows were too clean, and the rules were dressed in words like guidance and care. But she knew something waited underneath it all, not hidden by shadows, but hidden by politeness. She began to write her thoughts in a small cloth-bound diary she made herself from torn math pages and needle-threaded scraps. Each night, once the silver bell signaled silence and the others turned toward the walls in fear, she would reach beneath her mattress, count the floorboards, and remove a single loose stone behind her bed. She wrote without candlelight, memorizing the motions with her fingers, each letter a whisper her mouth could no longer make. She never wrote her own name, only initials, just in case. At first, the entries were simple. She wrote of strange shapes she saw drawn on the backs of children, circles with sharp points, symbols that didn't belong to any language she'd learned. She noted how the staff never spoke of bruises or marks. When one girl came back from a correction hour with red lines burned into her forearms shaped like starbursts, she was told it was a lesson in self-containment. Another child returned with no voice and a stitched mouth, actual thread through skin clumsily sewn, as if someone were learning how to suture using human lips. The child was gone the next morning. Her bed was made, her name erased from the roster board in the hall. Elspeth wrote about the geometric room, a place none of the children had seen but all had heard about, a chamber lined with slate, where the floor was scrubbed between every session, and where children were made to stand perfectly still inside shapes drawn in chalk. If they moved even once, they were shocked with a wire dipped in salt. She didn't know if it was true, but the stories came from too many mouths to be imagined. The worst entry came after a night of screaming that was silenced too quickly. Elspeth had pressed her ear to the floorboards and heard the drag of something heavy across stone. The next day she wrote of a boy, H, who had been buried up to his neck behind the greenhouse. The dirt was soft and insects had been released from a crate beside him. A child from the laundry wing had seen it from the attic vent, her knuckles white as she clutched the frame. They said he didn't scream. He just blinked and shook until they covered his head with a white cloth and left him there. When the storm came the next night, his name was gone from the morning roll. His boots remained in the hallway for another week before they disappeared too. Elspeth kept writing. Not because she believed she would survive, but because she knew someone someday might find it. And if they did, she wanted them to understand. The horror here was not wild or chaotic. It was careful, ritualized, measured by angles, bound in rules, and performed by people who smiled too much and punished without raising their voices. Symmetry was not just an aesthetic at Bell Hollow. It was law. The belief ran deepest in the oldest son, Ambrose Bell, whose obsession with perfection had been cultivated since childhood. He'd been born with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, something most never noticed, but which Silas had measured, documented, and corrected through a series of wooden braces and bleeding rituals. Ambrose learned early that imperfection was not a condition of the body, but a weakness of the soul. And so he grew into a man who flinched at uneven shoes, who recoiled from crooked smiles, who straightened every chair before he sat. Over time, this fixation became doctrine. The Bells began enforcing what they called pattern purity, a belief that disorder bred disobedience, and that imbalance, even in the smallest form, invited decay. Children at Bell Hollow were evaluated weekly in what they called mirroring sessions. They were paired off and examined side by side, posture, height, even blinking rhythms. Any deviation was documented in a red book Ambrose kept locked beneath his bed. At first, the corrections were minor, forced ambidexterity drills, haircuts done to match a peer, posture rods strapped to the back. But as weeks passed and the number of discrepancies grew, the adjustments turned surgical. A girl with a limp was forced to wear a brace that cut into her flesh until her gait matched the others. A boy whose right eye was larger than his left was made to sleep with a heated weight pressed to the socket. And in one case, a child with an extra finger had it removed without anesthesia, cauterized with a red-hot spoon, the wound praised as a sacred restoration. But the most disturbing event came with the arrival of the Tillman twins. James and Jonah, identical by birth but altered by circumstance. Jonah had been born with a minor cleft in his lower lip, repaired poorly by a country doctor. James had no such scar. To the Bells, this small flaw was an insult to natural order. Rather than accept the difference, they saw an opportunity for purification. Ambrose decided the boys must be made truly identical, not in the way nature intended, but in the way order demanded. First, Jonah was taken for a series of corrections. His lip was rebroken and stitched again, this time with finer thread. The skin was stretched, reshaped, forced to mimic James's down to the placement of a freckle. But it wasn't enough. Ambrose soon determined James must also change, to share the pain, to balance the process. His upper teeth were filed down, his nose subtly broken and reset. A scar was carved just beneath his chin to match one on Jonah's that had formed from a childhood fall. The procedures were not done in a single night. They happened slowly over months, always under the guise of reform. Neither boy was allowed to speak during the process. By the end, they no longer recognized themselves, or each other. They stopped speaking altogether, even during daylight. They moved in mirrored silence, heads tilted the same, shoulders held at the same angle, eyes hollow with the weight of being turned into copies. To the Bells, this was proof of success. In their doctrine, symmetry was purity, and purity was control. Disorder, physical, emotional, or spiritual, was a threat to be cut out, reshaped, or erased. They saw the world not as it was, but as it should be. A place where every shape had its match, every action its mirror, every child a mold. What couldn't be balanced was discarded. What couldn't be matched was never meant to remain. It began with the beds. One by one, they were found empty in the morning. Linen smoothed, pillows arranged precisely, no indentation, no warmth left behind. The children who had slept in them were simply gone. No announcement, no goodbye. Their names were removed from the attendance board with such quiet efficiency that only the other children noticed. Their few belongings, a brush, a toy, a torn book page, were taken to the furnace room behind the greenhouse and incinerated before breakfast. The smell lingered in the halls longer than their memories did. The Bells never spoke of them, never acknowledged their absence. It was as if they had never existed. But the others remembered, and they began to count. First it was Elsie from the East Dormitory, then Matthew, the boy who had a stammer and never looked anyone in the eye. Then the girl who kept biting her nails until her fingers bled, gone, as if plucked from the edge of reality. For a while the pattern was unclear. Then whispers began of the Star Chamber. No one had seen it clearly, no one returned from it. But a boy named Isaac, small, sharp-eyed, the kind who remembered everything, claimed he saw his roommate taken there. He'd awoken in the night to the sound of bells, not loud but soft, timed, like a slow pulse. He watched from the crack in the doorway as two staff members in black coats guided his friend Simon down the south corridor that led to the locked wing behind the old library. Simon never resisted. He looked dazed, as though dreaming while walking. When he didn't return the next day, Isaac followed the path. He stopped outside the black door, pressed his ear to the wood, and heard nothing. Then he looked through the keyhole and swore he saw mirrors. Tall, curved mirrors spinning slowly, their reflections sliding in and out of rhythm like oil on glass. In the center stood Simon, motionless, his arms hanging limp at his sides. And then, Isaac was certain of this, Simon faded. Not screamed, not pulled, not broken. He simply dissolved like salt in water until nothing remained but the hollow shape of where he'd stood. The other children didn't believe him at first, but fear has a way of creating belief. The rumors grew quickly. They said the Star Chamber was built on sacred geometry, that the mirrors weren't just mirrors but thresholds, that the rhythmic bells were tuned to brainwave frequencies that could disrupt the soul's attachment to the body. Some said the chamber was older than the school itself, part of the land long before Bell Hollow was raised. Others believed Silas had designed it from diagrams taken from forbidden medical texts, passed to him by a dying mentor whose eyes had gone blind from staring too long at perfect angles. None of it made sense, but children kept disappearing, and those left behind began sleeping in pairs, placing objects beneath their pillows as warnings. Hairpins, buttons, broken pencil tips, anything to know if someone had moved them in the night. It didn't help. The vanishings continued. Beds made themselves. Names vanished from memory faster than mouths could speak them. No one ever found the star chamber. No adult ever admitted it existed. But the rhythm of the bells, soft and distant, still pulsed through the stone walls every few nights, and the children who heard it would press their palms to their ears, praying not to be the next to fade. The bells believed it wasn't death. It was refinement beyond the physical, a final correction, to remove not just disobedience, but presence, to erase a soul so cleanly that even grief had nothing left to hold on to. Wicket was not a man people trusted. He drifted from town to town, his clothes always a little too damp, his fingers always stained with something earthy or burnt. He didn't speak much and rarely looked anyone in the eye. When he arrived in Quietude, he was hired by Bell Hollow Academy not because he impressed anyone, but because he asked no questions and charged no wage beyond meals and a bed in the tool shed. He slept beside the wheelbarrows and sacks of lime, kept his head low, and never asked why the children never smiled. But some men carry the curse of noticing, not because they want to, but because something in them was built to see what others ignore. And Wicket noticed things. He noticed the way light flickered beneath the floorboards of the north wing. Not the glow of lanterns, but something colder, paler, like moonlight filtered through bone. He noticed the soot patterns on the greenhouse chimney never matched the direction of the wind. He noticed how every mirror inside the school, from the dormitories to the washroom, had been covered with black cloth stitched tightly at the corners. And he noticed the muffled sounds, not quite screams, not quite singing, that seeped through the bricks of the old east wall every night just after the silver bell rang. He never asked questions. He only watched. And when he dug one afternoon near the rear garden to reset a water pipe, his shovel struck something that didn't belong. It wasn't stone. It was smooth and white, smaller than an animal bone, but unmistakably human. A child's femur. Tiny, perfect, preserved. He wrapped it in a cloth and kept it in his pocket for days, unsure what to do. The air around the school had started to feel different, heavier, like the pressure before a thunderstorm, and the children had grown quieter. Not just obedient, but drained, as if something was being taken from them each night while they slept. He caught one boy in the woods, curled behind a tree, muttering numbers over and over. Not prayers, not nonsense, but precise measurements, inch by inch, as though reciting blueprints from memory. That night, Wicket finally tried to speak. He stood at the edge of the dining hall, clutching the bone in his hand, and waited to be acknowledged. He never was. The bells looked through him. The children avoided his gaze. The staff smiled too long and too wide. So he ran. Down the hill, through the woods, into the heart of Quietude, coat unbuttoned, hair soaked with sweat, boots caked in ash from the greenhouse path. He burst into the tavern at full scream, holding up a scrap of cloth stained with soil, and wrapped around what he now saw was not a femur but a tooth. A child's molar. Pulled fresh, no rot, no root, he shouted of mirrors and bells, of wrong shapes and voices beneath the stone. He screamed that the walls were eating them, that the rooms were shifting when no one watched, that the children weren't dying. They were being rewritten. No one believed him. He was drunk, they said, mad from years alone. Some remembered he once spoke to dead birds and slept with his boots on backward to confuse demons. The sheriff walked him back to the edge of the property and told him never to return. But the next morning, his tools were found untouched, his bed unslept in, his satchel gone. He was never seen again. The Bells never addressed it. They simply replaced him with another man, clean-shaven, quiet, obedient. But the children remembered Wicket. Some claimed they saw him in the fog weeks later, watching from the tree line, his face thin, eyes bright, mouth moving like he was still trying to explain something. Others said he had buried more than the tooth, that somewhere beneath the roots of the lilacs or deep inside the coal pit was the rest of what he found, a secret he never had time to finish uncovering. Whatever truth Wicket carried died with him, or disappeared with him, or was swallowed by the quiet machinery of Bell Hollow's design. But for a brief flickering moment someone had noticed. Someone had tried to speak. And like everything else that did not fit the pattern, he was erased. The fire came quietly, as if the house had grown tired of holding secrets. By the time flames reached the rafters, Bell Hollow had long since been abandoned. The windows blackened with dust, the walls brittle with age. For decades, no one dared to enter, but when the land was finally sold and cleared in the fall of 1938 to make room for a new sanatorium, the workers uncovered more than rotted beams and crumbling chimneys. Beneath what used to be the east wing, hidden behind a double wall of brick and mortar so old it crumbled at a breath, they found a narrow iron door sealed with 7 rusted locks. The air that spilled out was wrong. Not just stale, but thick, humming with something that hadn't moved in 100 years. They called it a cellar, but it was more than that. Inside the room was round. 19 small wooden chairs formed a perfect circle, evenly spaced, each one bolted to the stone floor. Every chair had a set of restraints, not ropes or belts, but custom-forged iron cuffs attached at the legs, wrists, and across the chest. They were too small for adults, perfectly sized for children. In the center of the circle was a rusted drain, blackened at the edges, surrounded by etchings carved into the stone. Not words, not in any known language, but lines, spirals, intersecting triangles that repeated in patterns too precise to be accidental. Along the walls were shelves, and on those shelves hundreds of thin black journals stacked in order, each marked only by a symbol. No names, no dates. Inside them, pages filled with handwriting so fine it looked etched by a blade. Notes on breathing, on blinking, on posture under duress. Timed records of how long a child could hold still before tremors began. Observations on the fluttering of eyelids once the heart had stopped. Some entries included crude anatomical sketches, hands with nerve pathways marked in ink, diagrams of the skull with tiny dots where obedience resistance might live. A number of entries mentioned something called the threshold point, defined not by emotion but by stillness, the moment when the body no longer fought to move, when the will finally collapsed into pure submission. It was circled many times, always followed by the phrase, refined. The far wall had remnants of plaster masks. Child-sized faces molded and affixed in a row, most broken by time but a few still whole. The expressions were blank, their mouths slightly open as if caught mid-breath. Beneath them a metal cabinet had fused shut with rust. When forced open, it revealed a drawer of thin vials labeled only with single letters, B, L, E, and H, alongside a collection of blood-soaked cloths pressed into wax paper and sealed. Tests confirmed the blood had belonged to at least 7 different children. But no bodies were ever found. Not a single bone, not even a tooth, only chairs, only records. Only symbols. The cellar was sealed again by order of the town council, and the sanatorium was never built. The land remains undeveloped to this day, fenced off, marked only by a wooden plaque warning of soft ground. But those who entered the cellar, the workers, the inspectors, even the coroner, reported strange after effects. Nightmares of ringing bells, a sense of being watched in mirrors. One man claimed his daughter began drawing perfect circles in chalk without ever being taught. Another died by suicide 3 months later, leaving behind a journal with one sentence written over and over in red pencil. "We were data." What the Bells had built was not a school. It was not even a prison. It was a lab dressed in kindness, a ritual dressed in science, a system of purification for children who had simply needed to be loved. And what remained in the cellar proved one thing. The refinement had never been for education. It was for control. The data didn't end when the children did. It only stopped when there was no one left to measure. The insignia had been there from the beginning. Stamped on the gate in blackened iron, carved into the wooden banisters of the dormitory stairwells, embroidered above each child's bed on stiff linen banners that hung like commandments. A single unblinking eye, not stylized or decorative, not adorned with lashes or surrounded by light. Just the eye, always open, always watching. Most assumed it was a symbol of discipline, a reminder to the children that nothing went unnoticed. But long after Bell Hollow burned, long after the cellar was sealed and the records buried under silence, one historian tracing the genealogy of the Bell family came across an almost identical symbol deep in the archives of a forgotten religious order called the Vigilat Res, Latin for those who watch. What she found changed everything. The Vigilat Res had existed quietly in the shadows of European monastic orders as early as the 1600s. They were not a cult in the usual sense. There were no mass gatherings, no public proclamations, no wild acts of ecstasy. They were clinical, private, obsessed with the notion that human suffering was a necessary filter through which the soul must pass in order to become clean. Their philosophy centered on the belief that the senses were a betrayal, that sight led to temptation, sound to confusion, taste and touch to indulgence. Pain was seen not as punishment but as purification. Silence was truth, and the body, when made humble through surgical denial, the cutting of nerves, the blocking of sound, the sealing of eyes, would open the mind to higher planes of order. The historian found notes connecting a Samuel Bellerose, an apothecary in early 18th century France, to a manuscript called Clavis Interna, or the Inner Key. The book, long banned, was rumored to detail methods for spiritual calibration using bodily thresholds, how much suffering a person could endure before the ego fractured and what remained could be reshaped. The Bell family surname had been changed generations later after the death of a child in a ritual trial. But the practices endured, repackaged as educational reform, wrapped in clean language, wrapped in kindness. Bell Hollow Academy was never a school. It was a continuation. The insignia, the unblinking eye, was not symbolic. It was literal. It represented the divine organ, not of the body but of the watchers. Those who believed they had been chosen to observe the disorder in others and correct it without mercy. The Bells believed they were born to refine, not just behavior, but essence. They took notes the way a botanist might record the blooming of a rare flower. They measured breath, pain response, stillness, not for cruelty's sake, but for something colder, data. The experiments were not improvised. They were inherited, passed down from generations of quiet minds who believed chaos could be studied into silence. One of the journals found in the cellar bore a different handwriting than the others, sharper, older. It contained symbols that predated the school by decades and included references to oculi Dei, the God's eye, which they believed must be carved into the skin of at least one child every season to maintain balance. These carvings were done behind the ears beneath the scalp where hair would cover the healing. It was never meant to be seen, only felt. The child would wake altered, quieter, slower, emptied, what the Bells called hollowed. The eye on the wall had watched it all, not just as a warning but as a prayer, a reminder that perfection required sacrifice, that disobedience was imbalance, that those who resisted could be reshaped. The philosophy did not die with the bells. Traces of it lived on, in correctional institutions, in certain neurological clinics with unexplained methods, in whispers of behavior labs hidden under different names. The insignia appeared once more in the 1960s, etched into the corner of a research proposal for behavioral conditioning in children with abnormal social response. It was dismissed by most as a coincidence, but for those who knew, it was a sign that the watchers never left. They simply learned how to hide better. The discovery of the cellar in 1939 rattled Vermont to its roots. The town of Quietude, once known only for its remoteness and long winters, became the epicenter of one of the darkest reckonings in state history. But even as the photographs were taken and the investigators filled notebooks with trembling hands, there was a silence that lingered, pressing heavy across the town like smoke that wouldn't rise. The cellar hadn't just revealed a place of cruelty. It had uncovered a system, a philosophy too deliberate, too structured to be dismissed as madness. The records were too detailed, the restraints too carefully forged, the symbols too consistent across time. What had happened at Bell Hollow wasn't an accident of one broken man. It was the culmination of something that had been passed down, refined, normalized behind manners and education and lace. By spring, the press had caught hold. Headlines ran for weeks, carefully worded at first. Historic Academy tied to experimental practices on children. And then louder, sharper, as more journals were deciphered. 19 chairs, no graves. What happened at Bell Hollow? There were no known survivors, no death certificates, and no evidence that any of the 47 children officially enrolled had ever been transferred or withdrawn. Their names collected from scattered sources, a school ledger, a few archived letters, one surviving cousin's testimony, formed the basis of what became the Children's Protection Bill of 1942. It was the first of its kind in Vermont, outlining safeguards against institutional abuse, mandating record-keeping and prohibiting experimental procedures on minors without parental oversight or state review. But the name Bell never appeared in the bill, not once. The memorial was modest, a circular stone marker placed near the site of the old academy, now overgrown with thorn brush and damp moss. It bore no names, just an inscription, to those made to disappear before they could be heard. Local residents still avoid the land, even as new development attempts have failed year after year. The soil floods, foundations sink, machinery breaks inexplicably. Some say the land rejects permanence now. Others believe it remembers. Still, the echoes of Bell Hollow didn't die in the dirt. They traveled. In 1951, a psychologist in Boston published a paper on compliance induction through sensory isolation, citing unpublished case studies traced back to 19th century Vermont. In the 1960s, a military-funded research project explored behavior modulation through mirror exposure and sound deprivation, referencing a method of passive observation eerily similar to the glass room described in Bell's journals. By the 1980s, terms like threshold point, purity compliance, and post-hesitation obedience began appearing in niche psychiatric literature, stripped of their origins, rebranded as theoretical frameworks. Behind clinical language, the principles endured, not because they were true, but because they worked. Today, Bell methods still circulate in closed circles, not spoken publicly, but whispered in places where silence is currency, in elite behavior correction facilities and in black site interrogation programs, in forgotten institutions where desperate families still send their children to be fixed. The terminology has changed, but the thinking has not. Children who do not conform are still seen as errors to be corrected. Pain is still confused for discipline, stillness is still mistaken for peace, and the eye remains. Not always carved in stone or stitched into banners, but present, in logos, in diagrams, in offhand references, a single unblinking eye, quiet, watchful, patient. A reminder that some philosophies do not need cults or churches to survive. They just need order, repetition, and people willing to believe that silence is the same as salvation. In the decades since Bell Hollow was abandoned, no one has ever formally taken responsibility. No trials were held, no graves were found. The Bell family's records disappeared shortly after the cellar was sealed. Some believe they fled and changed names again, embedding themselves into other roles. Educators, doctors, even lawmakers. Others think the family line ended in fire and madness. But the truth may be worse, that they were never alone, that what they believed, the worship of control, the obsession with symmetry, the hunger for refinement, was never uniquely theirs. It was just one face of a broader, older sickness that knows how to wear good shoes and speak softly at the dinner table. Evil, it turned out, never needed to scream. It didn't need blood on the walls or monsters in the woods. It needed routine. It needed record-keeping. It needed the right kind of smile. What the Bell family perfected was a machine that punished without rage and experimented without guilt. A place where the line between education and erasure vanished beneath polished wood and folded linens. It wasn't chaos that consumed those children. It was order, sharpened until it bled. And now, all that remains is the silence. Not the kind that follows death, but the kind that precedes repetition. The kind that settles over forgotten places before something ancient begins again, with a new name, a new structure, and the same cold logic behind it. You can still visit the edge of the forest where Bell Hollow once stood. The trees lean strangely inward. The birds avoid the clearing. And sometimes, when the wind is still, you can hear a soft metallic chime, as if a small silver bell is ringing far below the ground. What do you think? Could something like this happen again? Or has it never stopped?